The helicopter's rotors whipped salt spray across the deck as Rebecca Chin stepped onto the oil rig platform, her designer boots slipping slightly on the wet metal grating. She wasn't supposed to be here, 30 miles off the coast of Louisiana, in the middle of the Gulf of Mexico, watching her multi-billion-dollar operation grind to a halt because of what her engineers called catastrophic equipment failure. She was supposed to be in her Manhattan penthouse, reviewing quarterly reports and preparing for tomorrow's board meeting. Instead, she was standing on a drilling platform that hadn't produced a single barrel in 3 days, costing her company approximately $2 million per hour. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The wind howled across the rig with a ferocity that seemed personal, as if the ocean itself was angry at her presence. Rebecca pulled her coat tighter and surveyed the chaos around her. Workers in hard hats and fluorescent vests moved with urgent purpose, their voices lost in the mechanical symphony of grinding gears, hissing steam, and the endless crash of waves against the platform's supports. Everything about this place screamed danger, from the towering drilling derrick that swayed ominously in the wind, to the maze of pipes and valves that could explode without warning. She had built an empire on places like this, but she had never actually set foot on one until today. What she didn't know was that her carefully orchestrated world of corporate meetings and calculated risks was about to collide with someone who understood this harsh environment in ways she never could. Someone who saw beauty in the brutal honesty of machines that either worked or didn't, who found purpose in solving problems with his hands rather than his wallet. Someone who would challenge everything she thought she knew about strength, about value, about what it meant to truly fix something broken. The morning had started like any other aboard Platform Delta 7, with Jake Morrison arriving before dawn to check the massive pumping systems that kept the oil flowing from deep beneath the ocean floor. At 34, Jake had spent nearly half his life working on rigs like this one, following in the footsteps of his father and grandfather before him. His hands were permanently stained with grease and salt, his face weathered by years of Gulf Coast sun and spray, but his eyes held the quiet confidence of a man who could make any machine sing when others had given up trying. Jake moved through the maze of pipes and valves with the fluid grace of someone who had memorized every bolt and gasket on the platform. He carried his tools in a battered leather bag his father had passed down to him, each wrench and screwdriver worn smooth by decades of use. The other workers respected him, not because he was the loudest or the strongest, but because when something broke, Jake Morrison could fix it. He approached machinery the way some people approached music, listening for the subtle changes in rhythm that meant trouble was brewing, feeling for the vibrations that spoke of metal fatigue or hydraulic failure. But this morning was different. As Jake made his rounds, checking pressure gauges and lubricating joints, he noticed something that made his stomach tighten with worry. The main drilling assembly was running hot, much hotter than it should be, and there was a vibration in the foundation that felt wrong. He had reported the anomaly to the platform supervisor 3 days ago, but corporate had insisted they keep drilling. Production quotas, they said. Shareholders, they said. Emergency repairs would have to wait until the scheduled maintenance window next month. Jake had seen this story before, and it never ended well. He thought about his 8-year-old son Tommy, safely tucked away in their small apartment back in New Orleans, probably getting ready for school right about now. Jake's ex-wife Lisa had left them both 2 years ago, unable to handle the long stretches when Jake was offshore, the constant worry that he might not come home. She had wanted him to find a safer job, something that would keep him on dry land. But Jake couldn't explain to her that this work was in his blood. The rigs were harsh and unforgiving, but they were honest. When something was broken, you could see it, touch it, fix it with your own hands. There was a purity to that kind of problem-solving that Jake found nowhere else. As the morning progressed, Jake's concerns proved justified. The vibration in the drilling assembly grew stronger, and the temperature readings climbed steadily toward the danger zone. He radioed the control room repeatedly, his voice calm but insistent as he requested permission to shut down the system for emergency repairs. Each time, he was told to monitor the situation and keep drilling. The corporate executives sitting in their air-conditioned offices hundreds of miles away couldn't feel the deck plates trembling beneath their feet or hear the subtle changes in the engine's rhythm that told Jake disaster was approaching. By noon, Jake knew they were running out of time. The main bearing in the drilling assembly was failing, and when it finally gave way completely, the resulting damage would shut down the entire platform for weeks, possibly months. He had seen similar failures before, and they usually ended with twisted metal, emergency evacuations, and sometimes injuries or worse. Jake made a decision that would have gotten him fired on most rigs, but that he knew was right. He shut down the drilling system anyway. The sudden silence was deafening. For the first time in months, Platform Delta 7 stopped producing oil. Jake stood in the engine room, watching the massive machinery wind down to a stop, knowing that he had just cost his employers millions of dollars, but possibly saved lives in the process. He began gathering his tools, mentally preparing for the confrontation that was sure to come. Corporate would want someone to blame for the production stoppage, and Jake had just made himself the obvious target. That was when the helicopter appeared. On the horizon, its sleek corporate logo gleaming in the afternoon sun. Jake watched through the grimy window of the engine room as it settled onto the platform's helipad, its rotors whipping up a storm of spray and debris. He had never seen that particular helicopter before, but he recognized the type. It was the kind that carried executives, the people who made decisions about his livelihood from behind mahogany desks in climate-controlled offices. Rebecca Chun emerged from the helicopter like a force of nature, her presence immediately commanding attention from every worker on the platform. She was younger than Jake had expected, probably in her early 30s, with the kind of polished confidence that came from never having to doubt whether people would listen when she spoke. Her dark hair was pulled back in a severe bun that somehow remained perfect despite the wind, and her clothes, while practical, bore the unmistakable mark of expensive tailoring. She moved across the deck with purpose, flanked by two assistants who struggled to keep up while juggling tablets and clipboards. Jake watched from a distance as Rebecca surveyed the silent drilling equipment, her face a mask of controlled frustration. She spoke briefly with the platform supervisor, a nervous man named Peterson who kept gesturing toward the engine room where Jake was working. Jake couldn't hear the conversation over the wind and the background noise of the platform's auxiliary systems, but he could see Peterson pointing in his direction and shaking his head. The body language told Jake everything he needed to know. He was about to become the scapegoat for the production shutdown. When Rebecca finally approached the engine room, Jake was bent over the failed bearing assembly, carefully documenting the damage with his phone camera. He didn't look up when her shadow fell across his workspace, but he was acutely aware of her presence. She smelled like expensive perfume and clean air, scents that seemed impossibly out of place in the grease-stained industrial environment of the rig. Rebecca cleared her throat, and Jake finally straightened to face her. Up close, she was even more formidable than she had appeared from a distance. Her eyes were dark and intelligent, missing nothing as they swept over Jake's oil-stained coveralls and tool-laden belt. When she spoke, her voice carried the crisp authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "Are you the one who shut down my drilling operation?" she asked, her tone neutral but with an edge that suggested she was not pleased with the answer she expected to receive. Jake met her gaze steadily, noting the unconscious emphasis she had placed on the word "my." So this was one of the corporate owners, not just another middle manager sent to assess the damage. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, Subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. He had never met any of the company's actual executives before, and he was surprised to find himself facing someone so young and obviously intelligent. Most of the corporate types he had encountered were older men who treated the rigs like abstract numbers on a spreadsheet rather than real places where real people worked dangerous jobs. "Yes, ma'am," Jake replied, his voice calm despite the churning in his stomach. The main bearing was failing. Another hour of operation, and we would have been looking at catastrophic damage to the entire assembly. Rebecca's eyes narrowed slightly, and Jake could see her calculating the cost of his decision. $2 million per hour in lost production, multiplied by however long the repairs would take, plus the cost of replacement parts and emergency helicopter flights to bring in specialized equipment. It was the kind of financial hit that could ruin careers and shut down platforms permanently. "And you made this decision on whose authority?" Rebecca asked, stepping closer to examine the damaged bearing that Jake had carefully extracted from the assembly. Her movements were precise and economical, betraying none of the uncertainty that most corporate executives showed when confronted with actual machinery. Jake felt a moment of surprise as he watched her examine the bearing. Most executives would have stood back and let their technical advisors handle the dirty work, but Rebecca seemed genuinely interested in understanding the mechanical failure herself. She held the heavy piece of metal with confidence, turning it over to examine the stress fractures and heat damage that had led to its failure. "Mine," Jake said simply. "I've been watching this bearing for 3 days. The temperature was climbing, the vibration patterns were all wrong, and the oil analysis showed metal contamination. I reported it to Peterson each day, but corporate ordered us to keep drilling." Rebecca's expression didn't change, but Jake noticed her grip tighten slightly on the damaged bearing. She was quiet for a long moment, studying the evidence of the mechanical failure with an intensity that surprised him. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a note of something Jake couldn't quite identify. Respect, perhaps, or maybe just professional curiosity. "Show me," she said, gesturing toward the disassembled drilling assembly. "Explain to me exactly what happened here." For the next hour, Jake found himself playing teacher to one of the most powerful executives in the petroleum industry, though he still didn't know her true identity. Rebecca asked intelligent questions about bearing loads and heat stress, nodding thoughtfully as Jake explained the cascade of failures that would have resulted if he hadn't shut down the system. She seemed genuinely interested in understanding not just what had gone wrong, but why Jake had been able to predict the failure when her corporate engineers had missed the warning signs. As they worked together in the cramped engine room, Jake began to notice details about Rebecca that didn't fit his mental image of a corporate executive. Her hands, while manicured, showed small calluses that suggested she wasn't afraid of manual work. She handled tools with competence, and when Jake needed an extra pair of hands to support a heavy component, she stepped in without hesitation. Most surprisingly, she seemed completely unbothered by the grease and oil that inevitably transferred to her expensive clothes during their impromptu mechanical autopsy. "You've done this before," Jake observed as Rebecca expertly positioned a hydraulic jack to help him lift the damaged assembly. "The way you handle the equipment, I mean." Most executives would be standing back taking notes while their engineers did the dirty work. Rebecca paused in her work, and for a moment her professional mask slipped slightly. Jake caught a glimpse of something more personal beneath the corporate facade, a hint of the person she might be when she wasn't commanding boardrooms and making million-dollar decisions. "I started from the bottom," she said quietly, her attention focused on adjusting the jack rather than meeting Jake's eyes. "Before I was making decisions about oil platforms, I was working on them. Different company, different lifetime, but the work hasn't changed much." Jake felt his estimation of her shift subtly. The idea that this polished executive had once worn coveralls and carried a tool bag seemed almost impossible, but the way she moved around the machinery suggested she was telling the truth. There was muscle memory in her movements, the kind of unconscious competence that could only come from years of hands-on experience. "What made you stop?" Jake asked, genuinely curious now about the woman who seemed so comfortable in his world, despite her obvious success in another one. Rebecca was quiet for so long that Jake thought she might not answer. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a weight that suggested the question had touched something deeper than professional small talk. "I got tired of being told I wasn't strong enough, smart enough, or tough enough to do the work I loved," she said, her words measured but edged with old anger. "So I decided to buy the companies that wouldn't hire me and change the rules." Jake found himself studying Rebecca with new interest. The transformation from rig worker to corporate executive must have required an almost unimaginable combination of intelligence, determination, and sheer force of will. He tried to imagine the young woman she must have been, fighting for respect in an industry dominated by men who probably saw her as an intruder in their exclusive club. As the afternoon wore on, Jake and Rebecca worked together to develop a repair plan for the damaged drilling assembly. What should have been a simple replacement job was complicated by the remote location of the platform and the specialized nature of the equipment. The bearing they needed wasn't something that could be picked up at a local parts supplier. It would have to be manufactured to specification and delivered by helicopter, a process that would take at least a week under the best circumstances. "The platform stays shut down until we can make the repairs properly," Rebecca announced, making a decision that Jake estimated would cost her company somewhere in the neighborhood of $50 million. "I won't risk anyone's safety to save money on my watch." Jake felt a grudging respect for her willingness to prioritize worker safety over profit margins. In his experience, most corporate executives would have pushed for a quick temporary fix that would get the oil flowing again, regardless of the long-term consequences. Rebecca's decision to shut down production completely until proper repairs could be made suggested a level of integrity that Jake hadn't expected to find in someone at her level of the corporate hierarchy. As the sun began to set over the Gulf of Mexico, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and red, Jake and Rebecca found themselves standing on the platform's observation deck, watching the helicopter that would take her back to the mainland prepare for departure. The wind had died down to a gentle breeze, and for the first time all day, conversation was possible without shouting over the mechanical noise of the drilling operation. "Your son," Rebecca said suddenly, catching Jake off guard with the personal turn in their conversation. "Peterson mentioned you have a boy back home." Jake nodded, surprised that she had bothered to ask about his personal life. "Tommy, he's 8. Lives with me when I'm on shore, stays with his aunt when I'm working." "That must be difficult," Rebecca said, her voice softer than it had been during their technical discussions. "Being away from him for weeks at a time." Jake shrugged. Gesture that didn't quite hide the pain the separation caused him. "It's the job. He understands that Daddy has to work on the big machines in the water to keep the lights on at home." Rebecca was quiet for a moment, watching the sun sink lower toward the horizon. When she spoke again, her voice carried a note of something that might have been regret. "I never learned how to balance those things," she admitted. "Work and family. I chose work, and I told myself it was because I didn't have a choice. But maybe I was just afraid of failing at something that couldn't be fixed with money or determination." Jake found himself looking at Rebecca with new eyes. Beneath the polished exterior and corporate confidence, he was beginning to see glimpses of a person who had paid a high price for her success. The admission that she had struggled with work-life balance humanized her in a way that surprised him. "It's never too late," Jake said, echoing words his own father had spoken to him after Lisa left. "The hardest repairs are the ones that matter most, but they're usually worth the effort." Rebecca turned to look at him, and for a moment her carefully maintained professional demeanor slipped completely. Jake saw vulnerability in her eyes, a loneliness that all her success and power couldn't quite mask. It was the look of someone who had climbed to the top of the mountain only to discover that the view from the summit was colder and more isolated than she had expected. The moment was broken by the helicopter pilot's voice over the radio, announcing that weather conditions were optimal for departure. Rebecca straightened, her corporate mask sliding back into place with practiced ease. When she spoke again, her voice had returned to its earlier professional tone. "Mr. Morrison," she said, extending her hand to shake his. "Thank you for your integrity today. Your decision to shut down the drilling operation may have saved lives, and it certainly prevented much more serious damage to the platform." Jake shook her hand, noting that her grip was firm and confident. "Just doing my job, ma'am. Making sure everyone goes home safe at the end of their shift." As Rebecca walked toward the waiting helicopter, Jake found himself watching her retreating figure with a mixture of respect and curiosity. She had surprised him in ways he hadn't expected, revealing depths beneath her corporate exterior that challenged his assumptions about the people who ran companies like the one he worked for. There had been moments during their collaboration when he had almost forgotten that she was an executive at all, times when she had seemed like just another experienced worker trying to solve a difficult technical problem. The helicopter lifted off into the gathering dusk, its navigation lights blinking steadily as it disappeared toward the mainland. Jake stood on the observation deck for a long time after it was gone, thinking about his conversation with Rebecca and the unexpected connection he had felt with someone from a world so different from his own. He wondered if he would ever see her again, or if she would remain just another brief encounter in the long string of corporate visitors who occasionally descended on the platform to check on their investments. What Jake didn't know was that Rebecca was having similar thoughts as she flew back toward New Orleans. She stared out the helicopter's window at the lights of Platform Delta 7 growing smaller in the distance, thinking about the quiet competence she had witnessed in Jake Morrison and the way he had challenged her assumptions about the people who did the actual work that made her empire possible. There had been something genuine about him that she rarely encountered in her corporate world, a straightforward honesty that had reminded her of who she used to be before she became Rebecca Chun, CEO, as the helicopter touched down at the private airfield outside New Orleans. Rebecca made a decision that would have surprised her board of directors and probably worried her assistant. Instead of flying directly back to New York for the morning's executive meetings, she decided to spend the night in Louisiana. She told herself it was for practical reasons, that she needed to visit the company's regional headquarters to coordinate the Platform Delta 7 repairs personally. But as she checked into a modest hotel near the industrial district where many of the rig workers lived, she admitted to herself that her motivations were more complex than simple business necessity. For the first time in years, Rebecca found herself genuinely curious about someone else's life. She wondered what kind of man raised a son alone while working one of the most dangerous jobs in the world. What kind of strength it took to make the right decision, even when it meant accepting personal consequences. What kind of integrity drove someone to put safety above profit when their own livelihood depended on keeping the corporate executives happy. As she lay in bed that night, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the industrial neighborhood outside her window, Rebecca realized that her encounter with Jake Morrison had awakened something in her that she had thought was buried forever. It wasn't attraction, exactly, though she couldn't deny that there had been something appealing about his quiet confidence and unwavering principles. It was more like recognition, the sense that she had met someone who understood something important, that she had forgotten somewhere along her climb to the top of the corporate ladder. Meanwhile, 30 miles offshore, Jake was making his final rounds of the silent drilling platform, checking systems and securing equipment for the night. The absence of the constant mechanical noise felt strange after months of 24-hour operations, but there was also something peaceful about the quiet. He found himself thinking about his conversation with Rebecca, replaying her words and trying to understand what had driven someone from his world into the rarefied atmosphere of corporate boardrooms. He thought about Tommy, asleep in his aunt's spare bedroom back in New Orleans, and wondered what his son would think of the woman who had spent the afternoon learning about bearing failures and hydraulic systems. Tommy was fascinated by his father's work, always eager to hear stories about the big machines that lived in the ocean, and Jake suspected his son would be impressed by someone who had worked her way up from the rigs to the executive suite. As he completed his security rounds and settled into his quarters for the night, Jake made a mental note to call Tommy in the morning and tell him about the lady executive, who wasn't afraid to get her hands dirty. It would make a good story, he thought, about how sometimes the most important people are the ones who remember where they came from. What neither Jake nor Rebecca realized was that their lives were about to become much more intertwined than either could have imagined. The bearing failure that had brought them together was just the beginning of a series of events that would challenge everything they thought they knew about their respective worlds and about themselves. In the corporate offices of Chun Petroleum Industries, Rebecca's decision to personally oversee the Platform Delta 7 repairs was already generating questions and speculation among her executive team, while 30 miles offshore, Jake's reputation as the mechanic who had shut down a multi-million-dollar operation was spreading through the tight-knit community of Gulf Coast rig workers. The next morning would bring new challenges and unexpected revelations that would test both their professional competence and their personal assumptions about each other. But for now, they slept in their separate worlds, each carrying the memory of an encounter that had felt different from the routine interactions that filled their daily lives, neither yet understanding that they had just met someone who would change the trajectory of their future in ways they couldn't begin to imagine. The morning sun cast long shadows across the industrial district of New Orleans as Rebecca walked the unfamiliar streets, her designer heels clicking against cracked sidewalks she would never have noticed from the back seat of her usual corporate limousine. She had awakened before dawn in the modest hotel room, her internal clock still set to New York time, and found herself unable to return to sleep. Instead of heading directly to the airport as her assistant had scheduled, she had made an impulsive decision to explore the neighborhood where many of the platform workers lived when they were on shore. The contrast with her usual environment was stark and somehow invigorating. Instead of gleaming skyscrapers and manicured corporate campuses, she found herself surrounded by weathered houses with front porches, where children's bicycles lay scattered and laundry hung on lines between buildings. The air smelled of coffee and something frying, mixed with the ever-present scent of the nearby industrial port. It was real in a way that her climate-controlled executive world had ceased to be years ago. Rebecca paused outside a small diner whose hand-painted sign advertised breakfast all day and fresh coffee always. Through the windows, she could see workers in coveralls and hard hats grabbing quick meals before heading to their shifts. The scene reminded her of her own early days in the industry, when she had survived on diner coffee and whatever cheap food she could afford between paychecks. On impulse, she pushed open the door and stepped inside. The conversation quieted momentarily as heads turned to assess the newcomer. Rebecca realized immediately that her tailored business attire marked her as an outsider in this blue-collar sanctuary, but the scrutiny was curious rather than hostile. A waitress with graying hair and kind eyes approached, coffee pot in hand and a welcoming smile on her face. "You're up early, honey," the waitress said, gesturing toward an empty booth near the window. "Most folks in suits don't wander in here until the lunch crowd starts looking for authentic local flavor." Rebecca slid into the booth and accepted the offered coffee gratefully. "I'm not most folks in suits," she replied, surprised by how easily the words came. "And I'm not looking for authentic local flavor. I'm looking for good coffee and maybe some insight into how this community really works." The waitress, whose name tag read Dolores, raised an eyebrow with interest. That's a different kind of honesty than we usually get from the corporate types. What kind of insight you looking for? Before Rebecca could answer, the door chimed again and Jake Morrison walked in, his work shirt bearing the logo of the offshore crew transport company. He moved with the easy familiarity of a regular customer, nodding to various occupants and heading directly toward the counter. Rebecca felt her pulse quicken unexpectedly at the sight of him, remembering their conversation on the platform and the way he had handled both the mechanical crisis and her interrogation with equal competence. Jake hadn't noticed her yet, absorbed in conversation with the cook about some mechanical problem with the restaurant's aging refrigeration unit. Rebecca watched as he listened intently to the man's description of strange noises and temperature fluctuations, asking the kind of detailed questions that revealed his instinctive approach to troubleshooting. Even in this casual setting, he carried himself with the quiet confidence she had observed on the platform, the assurance of someone who understood how things worked and how to fix them when they didn't. "That's Jake Morrison," Dolores said, following Rebecca's gaze. "One of the good ones. Been coming in here for years, always tips well. Always has time to help somebody with their car troubles or whatever. His boy comes in with him sometimes. Cute little thing with big eyes and his daddy's serious way of looking at the world." Rebecca found herself studying Jake with renewed interest, noting details she had missed during their professional interaction. On the platform, away from the industrial environment, she could see the deliberate care with which he moved, the way he gave his full attention to the cook's mechanical problem, despite clearly being on his way to work. There was a gentleness in his manner that hadn't been evident when he was focused on the bearing failure, a warmth that suggested depths beyond his technical competence. "He's single?" Rebecca asked, immediately regretting the personal nature of the question but finding herself genuinely curious about the man who had impressed her so thoroughly the day before. Dolores nodded with the knowing look of someone who had watched the neighborhood's romantic dramas unfold over countless cups of coffee. "His wife left about 2 years ago. Couldn't handle the offshore life, from what I heard. Jake took it hard. But he's been focused on raising that boy of his ever since. Works his rotation on the rigs, comes home for his days off, and spends every minute with Tommy." The information painted a picture of dedication that resonated with Rebecca in unexpected ways. She thought about her own choices, the relationships she had sacrificed for career advancement, the personal connections she had deemed too risky or time-consuming to pursue. Jake's commitment to his son spoke to priorities that she had convinced herself were luxuries she couldn't afford during her climb to corporate success. As if sensing her attention, Jake turned from his conversation with the cook and spotted Rebecca in the booth. His expression shifted from surprise to something that might have been pleasure, and he approached her table with a slight smile that transformed his normally serious features. "Miss Chun," he said, extending his hand in. "Greeting. I didn't expect to see you in Dolores's place. This is pretty far from the executive dining rooms." Rebecca shook his hand, noting again the callous strength of his grip and the direct honesty of his gaze. "I wanted to see where the real conversations happen," she replied. "Corporate dining rooms are great for quarterly reports and strategic planning, but they're terrible places to understand what people actually think and feel." Jake slid into the booth across from her without invitation, and Rebecca found herself pleased by his assumption of welcome. Dolores appeared immediately with another coffee cup, filling it without being asked and favoring Jake with the kind of maternal smile reserved for favored customers. "So what's the verdict on Charlie's refrigerator?" Dolores asked clearly, more interested in the mechanical diagnosis than the unusual pairing of her blue collar, regular with a woman who obviously moved in different circles. "Compressors running rough and the coolant's low," Jake replied, his attention momentarily focused on the technical problem. "Probably a slow leak in one of the lines. It'll limp along for another week or two, but Charlie should start looking for a replacement before it dies completely." Dolores sighed with the resignation of someone who knew that restaurant equipment always failed at the worst possible moments. "I'll tell him, but you know Charlie. He'll probably wait until it completely dies during the lunch rush on the busiest day of the month." After Dolores moved on to tend other customers, Jake turned his attention back to Rebecca, his expression curious but not intrusive. "What really brings you to this part of town?" he asked. "I'm guessing it's not part of your usual itinerary when you visit the Gulf Coast operations." Rebecca considered how to answer, torn between her instinctive corporate privacy and an unexpected desire to be honest with this man who seemed to value directness above politeness. "I realized yesterday that I'd been making decisions about people's lives and livelihoods for years without really understanding the human cost of those decisions," she said finally. "I wanted to see what that cost looks like up close." Jake studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "And what do you see?" "I see people who work dangerous jobs to support their families," Rebecca replied. "I see a community that takes care of its own. I see the kind of integrity that puts safety above profit, even when there are personal consequences." She paused, meeting his gaze directly. "I see things I forgot were important during my climb to the top." The honesty of her admission seemed to surprise Jake, and Rebecca saw his professional wariness give way to something more personal. "That's a rare kind of self-awareness in the corporate world," he said quietly. "Most executives I've met are more interested in justifying their decisions than questioning them." "Maybe that's because most executives have never been where you are," Rebecca said. "I started in this industry, Jake. I know what it feels like to have someone in a suit make decisions about your life without knowing your name or caring about your family." Jake leaned back in the booth, reassessing her with obvious interest. "You worked the rigs?" Rebecca nodded, feeling the weight of memories she rarely allowed herself to revisit. "Different company, different coast, but the same work. Same risks, same challenges, same feeling that the people making the real money didn't understand or appreciate what we were doing to earn it for them." "What changed?" Jake asked, his question carrying none of the judgment Rebecca had expected. "I got tired of being powerless," Rebecca replied. "I got tired of watching good people get hurt by bad decisions made by people who never got their hands dirty. So I decided to become one of the people making the decisions." Jake was quiet for a moment, processing this revelation. When he spoke again, his voice carried a new note of respect. "That takes serious determination, and probably more sacrifice than most people would be willing to make." Rebecca felt a familiar tightness in her chest at the mention of sacrifice. "More than I realized at the time," she admitted. "I told myself that personal relationships were a luxury I couldn't afford until I reached a position where I could make a real difference. But somewhere along the way, I forgot that the point of making a difference was supposed to be about people, not just profit margins." "It's not too late," Jake said, echoing the words she had spoken to him the previous day. "The best fixes are the ones that repair something that seemed permanently broken." Rebecca found herself studying Jake's face, noting the sincerity in his expression and the way his words seemed to carry the weight of personal experience. "You sound like someone who's had to make some significant repairs in his own life." Jake's smile was rueful, but not bitter. "Single fathers learn a lot about fixing things that seem beyond repair, including themselves." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Jake's work partner, a heavy-set man in his 50s who introduced himself as Bobby Tran. Bobby's presence shifted the dynamic at the table, bringing with it the easy camaraderie of co-workers who had learned to trust each other in dangerous situations. "Jake, we need to head out if we're going to catch the crew boat," Bobby said, then noticed Rebecca and offered a polite nod. "Morning, ma'am. Don't believe we've been introduced." "Rebecca," she said simply, not offering her corporate title or company affiliation. "I was just learning about the refrigerator repair industry." Bobby laughed, a rich sound that suggested he found genuine humor in the situation. "Well, you came to the right man. Jake can fix anything that's got moving parts and a few things that don't. Rescued my truck from the scrapyard twice. Fixed my wife's washing machine so many times I probably owe him a new one. And kept that old coffee maker at the platform running when any sane person would have declared it dead." "It's just about paying attention," Jake said, clearly uncomfortable with the praise. "Most things tell you what's wrong if you know how to listen, including people." Rebecca asked, the question slipping out before she could consider whether it was too personal. Jake met her gaze steadily. "Especially people," he said quietly. The moment stretched between them, charged with an understanding that went beyond their brief acquaintance. Rebecca felt herself drawn to this man's quiet wisdom, his ability to see beyond surfaces to the essential truth underneath. In her corporate world, such directness was rare and often dangerous, but here in this simple diner, it felt like exactly what she had been missing. Bobby cleared his throat, apparently sensing the undercurrents in the conversation. "Well, much as I hate to break up this philosophical discussion, we really do need to get moving. The crew boat won't wait, and I'd rather not spend my day off swimming back to shore." Jake stood reluctantly, pulling a few bills from his wallet to cover his coffee. As he prepared to leave, he hesitated, then looked back at Rebecca with an expression that seemed to wrestle with some internal decision. "I'm off rotation this weekend," he said finally. 3 days on shore before the next crew change. If you're still in town and you want to see more of how this community really works, I could show you around. Nothing fancy, just the places where real people live real lives." Rebecca felt her pulse quicken at the unexpected invitation. In her corporate life, such offers were usually strategic, laden with hidden agendas and calculated advantages. But something in Jake's manner suggested this was simply a genuine offer from someone who thought she might benefit from a broader perspective on the world she had risen above. "I'd like that," she said, surprised by how much she meant it. "I'm staying at the Riverside Inn downtown. Not exactly local flavor, but it was the closest thing to the industrial district I could find on short notice." Jake smiled, the expression transforming his serious features in a way that made Rebecca's chest tighten unexpectedly. "I know the place. I'll pick you up Saturday morning around 9, if that works. Dress down," he added with a hint of amusement. "Where we're going, business suits mark you as either a tourist or someone from corporate headquarters." After Jake and Bobby left for their shift, Rebecca remained in the booth, nursing her coffee and processing the unexpected turn her trip had taken. She had come to New Orleans to oversee repairs to a critical piece of infrastructure, but somehow she had found herself agreeing to spend her weekend with a man who represented everything she had left behind in her climb to corporate success. Her phone buzzed with messages from her assistant, reminders about the board meeting she was supposed to attend, urgent requests for decisions on matters that had seemed critically important just 24 hours ago. But as she read through the corporate demands competing for her attention, Rebecca found herself thinking instead about Jake's invitation and what it might reveal about the person she had been before she became Rebecca Chun, CEO, that evening. Rebecca called her assistant and cleared her weekend schedule, citing the need for extended oversight of the Platform Delta 7 situation. It wasn't entirely untrue, she told herself. Understanding the human element of her business operations was a legitimate executive concern, even if her methods were somewhat unconventional. As she prepared for bed in her modest hotel room, Rebecca found herself looking forward to Saturday morning with an anticipation she hadn't felt in years. She couldn't remember the last time she had made plans based on curiosity rather than strategic advantage. Couldn't recall when she had last been excited about spending time with someone simply because she enjoyed their company. Meanwhile, 30 miles offshore, Jake was completing his evening maintenance rounds on Platform Delta 7, checking the temporary repairs that were keeping essential systems operational. while they waited for the replacement bearing to arrive. The platform felt different without the constant noise and vibration of the drilling operation. Quieter but also somehow more peaceful. As he worked, Jake found himself thinking about his unexpected encounter with Rebecca that morning. There had been something different about her away from the corporate environment of the platform, a vulnerability beneath her professional competence that intrigued him. Her admission about forgetting what was important during her rise to executive success had resonated with his own struggles to balance work demands with his responsibilities as a father. Jake thought about Tommy, currently staying with his sister-in-law while Jake completed his rotation. His son was always full of questions about the work Jake did offshore, fascinated by the massive machinery and complex systems that kept the oil flowing. Jake wondered what Tommy would think of Rebecca, whether his son would be impressed by someone who had worked her way up from the rigs to the executive suite. The idea of introducing Tommy to Rebecca surprised Jake with its appeal. He rarely brought people into his son's life, protective of the stability they had built together after Lisa's departure. But something about Rebecca's straightforward honesty and genuine interest in understanding his world suggested she might be different from the usual parade of corporate visitors who saw the platform workers as interchangeable components in a profit-generating machine. Saturday morning arrived gray and humid, with the kind of heavy cloud cover that promised afternoon thunderstorms. Rebecca had spent considerable time choosing what to wear, finally settling on jeans and a simple cotton shirt that she hoped would pass Jake's dress-down requirement. Standing in front of the hotel mirror, she barely recognized herself without her usual corporate armor of tailored suits and expensive accessories. Jake arrived precisely at 9 o'clock, driving a pickup truck that had clearly seen better days, but was meticulously maintained. He emerged from the driver's seat wearing jeans and a faded t-shirt that revealed the lean strength of someone who made his living with physical labor. His smile as he approached the hotel entrance was warm and genuine, lacking any of the calculated charm Rebecca was accustomed to in her professional interactions. "Ready for the grand tour of authentic New Orleans?" he asked, his tone carrying a hint of self-deprecating humor. "I promise it's nothing like the tourist version." Rebecca found herself returning his smile with an ease that surprised her. "I'm ready," she said. "Where are we starting?" "With the most important meal of the day," Jake replied, gesturing toward his truck. "But not where you think." Their first stop was a small market in a residential neighborhood, where Jake was greeted by name by the elderly woman behind the counter. He purchased coffee, fresh bayonets, and what appeared to be ingredients for sandwiches, explaining to Rebecca that their destination didn't serve food, but welcomed visitors who brought their own. "Where exactly are we going?" Rebecca asked as they climbed back into the truck. "The park where Tommy plays when I'm on shore," Jake replied. "Saturday mornings are when the kids have their soccer games, and the parents gather to watch and catch up on neighborhood news. It's where you go if you want to understand how this community really works." The park was nothing special by corporate standards. Just a few acres of grass with aging playground equipment and a soccer field marked by cones rather than permanent fixtures. But as Jake led Rebecca toward a group of parents clustered around folding chairs and coolers, she could see the bonds of genuine community that connected these people. Children ran across the field with the unself-conscious joy that Rebecca remembered from her own childhood, while parents shouted encouragement and friendly advice from the sidelines. There was an easy intimacy to the interactions, the kind of familiarity that could only develop over time among people who had chosen to invest in each other's lives. Jake introduced Rebecca simply as a friend, offering no explanation of her corporate identity or connection to the petroleum industry. The parents welcomed her with the casual warmth that seemed characteristic of this neighborhood, making room in their circle and sharing coffee and conversation without preamble or pretense. "You have kids?" asked Maria, a woman in her 40s, whose son was playing goalkeeper for one of the teams. Rebecca shook her head, feeling the familiar tightness that always accompanied questions about the family she had never had time to build. "No, just curious about how communities like this work." "It's pretty simple," said another parent, a man whose weathered hand suggested outdoor work. "We all look out for each other's kids, help when someone's struggling, celebrate when things go well. Nothing fancy, just people caring about people." As they watched the game unfold, Rebecca found herself drawn into conversations about school fundraisers, neighborhood safety concerns, and the small triumphs and challenges that made up the daily fabric of these families' lives. It was startlingly different from her usual social interactions, which tended to revolve around business strategy, market analysis, and competitive positioning. "Jake tells us you work in the oil industry," Maria said during a break in the game. "That must be exciting, all that travel and high-level decision-making." Rebecca glanced at Jake, wondering how much he had revealed about her role in the industry. His expression was neutral, suggesting he had kept her corporate identity to himself. "It has its moments," she replied carefully. "But I'm learning that the real interesting work happens at the operational level, with the people who actually make the industry function." "That's Jake's world," said the weathered man, whose name was Carlos. 20 years on the rigs, and he can still tell you the first name of every roughneck he's ever worked with. Says the machinery's only as good as the people who understand how to make it sing." Rebecca looked at Jake with new interest. 20 years? You started young." Jake nodded, his attention ostensibly focused on the soccer game but clearly aware of her scrutiny. 16, with my father's crew. Lied about my age and learned on the job. Different world back then, fewer safety regulations and a lot more room for stupidity. And a lot more room for real learning, Carlos added. These days, everything's computerized and regulated to death. Still need people who can think with their hands, though. Jake's one of the few left who can diagnose a problem by listening to the machinery. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a small boy who launched himself at Jake with the confidence of someone certain of his welcome. Tommy Morrison was a miniature version of his father, with the same serious dark eyes and careful way of observing the world around him. "Dad, you missed my goal," Tommy announced. Not accusingly, but with the matter-of-fact disappointment of a child whose father had missed an important moment. "I saw the setup," Jake replied, sweeping his son into a hug that spoke of deep affection. "Carlos told me it was a thing of beauty. Pure skill and perfect timing." Tommy beamed at the praise, then noticed Rebecca with the frank curiosity of childhood. "Are you Dad's friend?" he asked directly. "I'm Rebecca," she replied, crouching to meet him at eye level. "Your dad's been showing me around the neighborhood. Do you like soccer?" Tommy asked, apparently assessing her worthiness based on her sporting preferences. "I never learned to play," Rebecca admitted. "But I enjoyed watching your game. Your dad tells me you're also interested in machines and how they work." Tommy's face lit up with enthusiasm. "Dad's teaching me about engines and stuff. I can already change the oil in his truck, and he's going to show me how to fix the lawnmower next week." Rebecca found herself genuinely charmed by the boy's excitement and impressed by Jake's commitment to sharing his mechanical knowledge with his son. "That sounds like valuable education," she said seriously. "Understanding how things work is an important skill." "Dad says everything has a purpose," Tommy continued, clearly pleased to have found an interested adult audience. "Even the broken stuff just needs someone to figure out what went wrong and how to make it better." The simple wisdom of the child's words struck Rebecca with unexpected force. She thought about her own life, the broken relationships and abandoned priorities that she had never bothered to repair because she had been too focused on building something new and presumably better. Perhaps Jake's approach to mechanical problems offered lessons that extended beyond the purely technical. As the morning progressed, Rebecca found herself increasingly comfortable in this environment of casual community interaction. The conversations were real in a way that her corporate networking had never been, focused on shared experiences and genuine concern for each other's welfare rather than strategic advantage or competitive positioning. When the soccer games ended and the families began to disperse, Jake suggested they continue their tour with a visit to the community center where he volunteered on his days off. The building was older and clearly operated on a limited budget, but it hummed with activity as children and teenagers participated in various programs while parents attended GED classes and job training sessions. "This is where the real work happens," Jake explained as they walked through the facility. "Soccer games and neighborhood barbecues are nice, but this is where people get the tools they need to build better lives for their families." Rebecca watched Jake interact with the center's staff and participants, noting the respect and affection that characterized these relationships. He wasn't just a volunteer here. He was clearly someone the community had come to depend on for both practical help and emotional support. Mr. Jake called a teenage girl who was working on what appeared to be a small engine repair project. "Can you look at this carburetor? I think I've got the jets cleaned, but it's still not running right." Jake moved to examine the girl's work, praising her thorough cleaning job while pointing out an adjustment that would improve the fuel mixture. Rebecca watched the interaction with growing understanding of the man Jake Morrison really was. His mechanical expertise was just one facet of a deeper commitment to helping people solve problems and build skills that would serve them throughout their lives. "Automotive repair program?" Rebecca asked, joining them at the workbench. "Life skills program," Jake corrected gently. "Teaching kids that they don't have to pay someone else to fix everything that breaks, that they can learn to solve their own problems with patience and the right tools." The girl, whose name was Ashley, looked up from her carburetor with obvious pride. "Mr. Jake says mechanical skills transfer to everything. If you can diagnose why an engine won't start, you can figure out why a job interview didn't go well or why a relationship isn't working." Rebecca found herself impressed by both the girl's insight and Jake's approach to mentoring. "That's a sophisticated way of thinking about problem solving," she said to Ashley. "Are you planning to work in automotive repair?" Ashley shook her head with a smile. "I want to be an engineer. But Mr. Jake says understanding how things work with your hands makes you a better engineer than just knowing the theory." "He's absolutely right," Rebecca said, thinking about her own early experience with hands-on mechanical work and how it had informed her later understanding of industrial operations. "The best engineers I've worked with started by getting their hands dirty." As they continued through the community center, Rebecca saw evidence of Jake's influence everywhere. A group of boys working on bicycle repairs under his guidance, a computer lab where he had apparently rewired the electrical systems, a bulletin board covered with thank you notes from people whose cars he had fixed or whose appliances he had rescued from premature retirement. "You've built something important here," Rebecca observed as they paused in the main lobby to watch a group of children engaged in what appeared to be a robotics project. Jake shrugged with characteristic modesty. "Community builds itself. I just try to contribute whatever skills I have that might be useful." "Don't let him fool you," said a voice from behind them. They turned to see an older woman approaching, her name tag identifying her as Margaret Williams, Center Director. "Jake Morrison is the reason half these programs exist. When we needed someone to teach automotive skills, he designed the curriculum. When our heating system failed last winter, he rebuilt it from scratch. When we couldn't afford to hire qualified instructors, he recruited volunteers from his network and trained them himself." Rebecca felt her estimation of Jake shift once again, recognizing the kind of leadership and community investment that created lasting positive change. In her corporate world, such dedication would have been rewarded with promotions, stock options, and executive recognition. Here, Jake's reward seemed to be the satisfaction of seeing people develop skills and confidence that would serve them for life "The center's lucky to have him," Rebecca said, meaning it sincerely. Margaret smiled with the warmth of someone who had seen countless volunteers come and go. "We know it. The question is whether he knows how much he means to this community." As they prepared to leave the community center, Tommy reappeared with a group of friends in tow, their faces flushed with the excitement of children who had spent the morning in energetic play. "Dad, can Rebecca come to lunch with us?" he asked, with the direct honesty that characterized his approach to the world. Jake looked at Rebecca questioningly, and she found herself nodding before she had consciously decided to accept the invitation. "I'd like that," she said, surprised by how much she meant it. Their lunch destination was Jake's own modest home, a small but meticulously maintained house in a neighborhood of similar working-class residences. The interior was simple and functional, furnished with pieces that had clearly been chosen for durability rather than style. But everything was spotlessly clean and organized with the precision of someone who understood the importance of knowing where tools belonged. What struck Rebecca most forcefully about Jake's home was the evidence of his dedication to his son. Tommy's artwork covered the refrigerator. His school projects were displayed with obvious pride, and the living room contained a carefully organized collection of educational toys and books that suggested a parent who took his child's intellectual development seriously. "Tommy's room," Jake said, noticing Rebecca's interest in the family photos that lined the hallway. "He designed the layout himself, including the workspace where he practices the mechanical skills we work on together." Rebecca peered into the boy's room and was impressed by the child-sized workbench complete with age-appropriate tools and several completed projects that demonstrated genuine skill and patience. "You're raising an engineer," she observed. "I'm raising someone who won't be helpless when the world doesn't work the way he expects," Jake corrected. "Whether that makes him an engineer or a teacher or anything else is up to him." Lunch was simple sandwiches and homemade soup, but the conversation around Jake's kitchen table was rich with the kind of family intimacy Rebecca had never experienced. Tommy chattered about his morning's adventures. Jake shared stories from his week on the platform, and Rebecca found herself contributing observations about the community center and the neighborhood that revealed how much she had noticed and appreciated during their morning together. "Rebecca works with oil rigs too," Tommy announced at one point, apparently having absorbed this information from earlier conversations. "Maybe she knows some of the same machines Dad works on." "Different rigs, different machines," Rebecca replied diplomatically, "but the same basic principles. Your dad's teaching you skills that would serve you well in any industrial environment. Are you going to work on the rigs forever?" Tommy asked Jake, the question carrying the weight of a child who understood that his father's work was both important and dangerous. Jake considered the question seriously, apparently recognizing its significance to his son. "As long as I can do the work safely and well," he said finally. "But I'm also learning other skills, like teaching and community organizing, that might lead to different opportunities someday." Rebecca found herself curious about Jake's long-term plans, wondering whether he had ever considered moving beyond operational roles into management or consulting positions that would utilize his extensive experience while offering greater stability and safety. But she sensed that such questions would be premature in their developing relationship, more appropriate for future conversations when they knew each other better. As the afternoon wore on, Rebecca realized that her weekend tour of authentic New Orleans had become something more significant than cultural education. She was experiencing a way of life that she had abandoned during her climb to corporate success, rediscovering values and priorities that she had convinced herself were incompatible with professional achievement. Watching Jake interact with his son, seeing the respect and affection he commanded in his community, observing the quiet satisfaction he derived from solving problems and helping others, Rebecca began to question assumptions about success and fulfillment that had guided her. choices for decades. Perhaps there were ways to make a meaningful difference in the world that didn't require sacrificing everything personal and genuine in pursuit of power and wealth. As evening approached, and the time came for Rebecca to return to her hotel, she found herself reluctant to end what had been one of the most enlightening days she could remember. Standing on Jake's front porch while Tommy played in the yard with neighborhood children, she struggled to find words that would express her gratitude without revealing how profoundly the experience had affected her. "Thank you," she said finally. The simple words carrying more weight than any corporate expression of appreciation she had ever offered. "This has been more valuable than you probably realize." Jake studied her face in the fading light, and Rebecca sensed that he understood the significance of what she was trying to communicate. "You're welcome here anytime," he said quietly. "This community doesn't judge people by what they do for work or how much money they make. We judge them by how they treat each other and whether they're willing to contribute something positive." As Rebecca walked toward her rental car, she felt Tommy's small hand slip into hers. "Will you come back?" he asked with the directness that seemed to be a family trait. Rebecca looked down at the boy's earnest face, then back at Jake, who was watching their interaction with an expression she couldn't quite read. "I'd like to," she said honestly. "If your dad doesn't mind having me around." "He doesn't mind," Tommy announced with the confidence of a child who understood his father's moods and preferences. "He likes you, I can tell." The simple observation sent an unexpected warmth through Rebecca's chest, a feeling she hadn't experienced in years of carefully calculated professional relationships. As she drove back toward the hotel, she found herself thinking not about the corporate demands awaiting her return to New York, but about when she might have another opportunity to spend time in this world of genuine human connection and purposeful work. What Rebecca didn't know was that Jake was having similar thoughts as he watched her taillights disappear into the gathering dusk. For the first time since his divorce, he had shared his world with someone who seemed to appreciate not just its surface charm, but its deeper values. The way Rebecca had interacted with Tommy, her genuine interest in the community center's programs, her respectful engagement with his neighbors, all suggested a person whose corporate success hadn't completely eliminated her capacity for authentic human connection. As he tucked Tommy into bed that night, Jake found himself answering his son's questions about Rebecca with an openness that surprised him. Yes, she was different from most people they knew. Yes, she seemed genuinely interested in understanding how their community worked. Yes, it was possible they would see her again. What Jake didn't tell his son was how much he hoped that possibility would become reality. The emergency call came at 3 a.m, jarring Rebecca from the deepest sleep she had experienced in months. Her phone buzzed insistently on the hotel nightstand, displaying the number for Petroleum's crisis management hotline. She answered on the second ring, her mind immediately sharp despite the early hour. "Miss Chun, this is Operations Control," came the urgent voice of her night shift supervisor. "We have a situation developing at Platform Delta 7. The temporary repairs are failing faster than anticipated, and we're looking at potential environmental hazard if the primary containment systems give way." Rebecca sat up in bed, her heart racing as she processed the implications. Platform Delta 7 was not just another drilling operation. It was one of the most productive wells in the Gulf, and its failure could result in an environmental disaster that would make national headlines and potentially destroy her company. More importantly, there were 43 workers on that platform whose lives could be at risk if the situation deteriorated further. "What's the current status?" she asked, already reaching for her clothes as she spoke. "Containment holding for now, but the backup systems are showing stress fractures. The platform supervisor is requesting immediate evacuation of non-essential personnel, but someone needs to stay on site to monitor the primary systems and coordinate emergency repairs." Rebecca closed her eyes, running through her options with the rapid calculation that had made her successful in the corporate world. She could order a complete evacuation and accept the environmental and financial catastrophe that would follow, or she could gamble on emergency repairs that might save the platform but would require keeping skilled workers in harm's way. "I'm on my way," she said finally. "Have the emergency helicopter ready for departure in 30 minutes, and get me a direct line to the platform supervisor." As Rebecca dressed hurriedly in the practical clothing she had worn for her weekend tour with Jake, she found herself thinking about their conversations regarding the balance between profit and safety. The irony was not lost on her that she was now facing exactly the kind of crisis decision that separated principled leadership from purely financial calculation. The helicopter ride to Platform Delta 7 was a nightmare of wind and rain, with the pilot fighting to maintain control in weather conditions that were barely within acceptable limits for flight. Rebecca spent the journey reviewing technical reports and emergency protocols, but her mind kept returning to Jake's words about putting safety above profit, even when there were personal consequences. When the helicopter finally touched down on the platform's helipad, Rebecca was met by Peterson, the platform supervisor, whose haggard appearance spoke to the stress of managing a potentially catastrophic situation with insufficient resources and mounting pressure from corporate headquarters. "Thank God you're here," Peterson shouted over the wind and mechanical noise. "The situation's deteriorating faster than we anticipated. The temporary bearing we installed is failing, and the vibrations are causing stress fractures throughout the primary support structure." Rebecca followed Peterson into the relative quiet of the platform's control room, where banks of monitors displayed real-time data on every system aboard the massive structure. The readings painted a grim picture of escalating mechanical failure, an environmental risk that could spiral beyond control at any moment. "Where's Morrison?" Rebecca asked, scanning the room for Jake's familiar figure. Peterson's expression grew troubled. "He's down in the engine room trying to jury-rig additional support for the failing systems. He's been down there for 6 hours straight, refusing relief because he says he's the only one who understands exactly how the temporary repairs are integrated with the original systems." Rebecca felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. The idea of Jake working alone in the most dangerous part of the platform during a mechanical crisis filled her with a fear that surprised her with its intensity. In the short time she had known him, she had come to rely on his expertise and judgment in ways that went beyond their professional relationship. "I need to see him," she said, already moving toward the door that led to the platform's industrial sections. Peterson caught her arm gently but firmly. "Miss Chun, with respect, the engine room is no place for corporate personnel during an emergency. The noise levels alone could cause permanent hearing damage, and if something gives way while you're down there." Rebecca turned to face Peterson with an expression that left no room for argument. "I've worked in engine rooms before, and I'm not just corporate personnel. I'm the person who has to decide whether to evacuate this platform or risk leaves trying to save it, and I can't make that decision without understanding exactly what we're dealing with." The journey through the platform's interior was like descending into the mechanical heart of some enormous beast. The noise level increased with each level they descended, until conversation became impossible and communication reduced to hand signals and urgent gestures. The air grew thick with the smell of heated metal and hydraulic fluid, and the entire structure vibrated with the strain of systems pushed far beyond their design limits. When they finally reached the engine room, Rebecca saw Jake hunched over a complex assembly of pipes and valves, his movements precise despite the chaos surrounding him. He had rigged an elaborate system of additional supports and bypass connections that were clearly improvised, but showed the kind of mechanical intuition that came from decades of experience with industrial systems under stress. Jake looked up as Rebecca and Peterson entered the room, and his expression shifted from surprise to something that might have been concern. Even in the midst of a potential disaster, he seemed more worried about her safety than his own situation. "You shouldn't be down here," he shouted over the mechanical din, moving toward them while wiping his hands on a rag that was already soaked with grease and coolant. "I needed to see what we're dealing with," Rebecca replied, raising her voice to be heard over the noise. "How bad is it really?" Jake's expression was grim as he gestured toward the jury-rigged support system he had constructed. "The temporary bearing is disintegrating faster than we anticipated. I've managed to distribute some of the load to secondary systems, but it's a stopgap measure at best. We might have hours, or we might have minutes before the whole assembly comes apart." Rebecca studied the improvised repairs, recognizing the ingenuity and skill that had gone into their construction. Jake had essentially rebuilt critical portions of the platform's infrastructure using whatever materials were available, creating solutions that no engineering textbook would have recommended, but that showed profound understanding of mechanical systems under extreme stress. "What do you need to make a permanent fix?" she asked, already calculating the resources that could be mobilized and the time required to implement more comprehensive repairs. Jake shook his head, his expression troubled. "It's not about what I need," he said. "It's about what's safe. The stress fractures are spreading through the support structure, and every minute we delay evacuation increases the risk of catastrophic failure. From an engineering standpoint, the responsible decision is to shut down the platform and evacuate immediately." Rebecca felt the weight of the decision settling on her shoulders. Jake was essentially recommending that she accept the environmental and financial disaster that would follow a complete platform shutdown, putting safety considerations above the corporate pressures that demanded she find a way to keep the operation running. "And from a personal standpoint?" she asked, studying his face for any sign of the calculation that would have characterized such a conversation with her corporate engineers. Jake met her gaze steadily, and Rebecca saw no trace of the political maneuvering that usually surrounded such critical decisions. "From a personal standpoint, I have a son who needs his father to come home safely," he said quietly. "And I've learned that no amount of money is worth compromising the things that really matter." The simple honesty of his answer struck Rebecca with profound force. Here was a man who could have positioned himself as indispensable to the repair effort, who could have used the crisis to demonstrate his value to corporate management, but instead he was recommending the course of action that prioritized safety over all other considerations. Before Rebecca could respond, a new alarm began sounding throughout the platform, its urgent tone indicating that another critical system had reached the failure point. Peterson's radio crackled with reports from various sections of the platform, all confirming that the mechanical situation was deteriorating rapidly. "Primary containment showing stress indicators," came the voice from the control room. "Recommend immediate implementation of emergency protocols." Rebecca looked around the engine room, taking in the improvised repairs, the spreading stress fractures, and the faces of the workers who were looking to her for leadership in a situation that offered no good options. The corporate training that had prepared her for executive decision-making had never addressed scenarios where human lives hung in the balance of choices that would be measured in minutes rather than quarterly reports. "Give the evacuation order," she said finally, her voice carrying across the engine room with quiet authority. "Non-essential personnel off the platform immediately. Skeleton crew only to monitor the shutdown procedures." Peterson nodded with obvious relief and began speaking rapidly into his radio, coordinating the evacuation that would save lives, but cost the company hundreds of millions of dollars. Rebecca watched the organized chaos of emergency procedures, feeling the weight of a decision that would probably end her corporate career, but that she knew was right. "I'm staying," Jake announced, already moving back toward his improvised repair station. "Someone needs to monitor the shutdown procedures and make sure the containment systems hold during the evacuation." Rebecca felt her heart clench with fear and admiration in equal measure. Jake's decision to remain on the platform during the most dangerous phase of the emergency was exactly the kind of selfless commitment that had impressed her from their first meeting, but it also meant he would be risking his life to protect people who were already in the process of reaching safety. "You don't have to do this," she said, moving closer to him as Peterson coordinated evacuation procedures with the control room. "The automatic systems can handle the shutdown sequence." Jake shook his head, his attention already focused on the monitoring equipment that would tell him whether the containment systems were holding under the stress of the emergency shutdown. "Automatic systems don't adapt when something unexpected happens," he said. "If the containment fails during evacuation, someone needs to be here to implement manual overrides." Rebecca realized that Jake was essentially volunteering to go down with the ship, staying behind to ensure that his co-workers reached safety, even if it meant sacrificing his own chance of survival. The heroism of his decision was matched only by its devastating personal implications for both him and his son. "Then I'm staying too," Rebecca announced, surprising herself with the immediacy of her decision. Both Jake and Peterson turned to stare at her, their expressions reflecting shock and concern in equal measure. In her corporate world, executives were insulated from physical risk by layers of safety protocols and liability considerations. The idea of a CEO voluntarily remaining in a dangerous situation was almost unprecedented. "Absolutely not," Jake said firmly, his voice carrying an authority that Rebecca had never heard from him before. "This isn't your responsibility, and Tommy needs his father more than this platform needs another pair of hands." Rebecca felt something shift inside her chest at Jake's mention of his son, recognizing the profound sacrifice he was making and the trust he was placing in her judgment. But she also understood that her own decision to stay was driven by more than corporate responsibility or professional obligation. "This is my platform," she said quietly, the words carrying more weight than Jake could possibly understand. "My responsibility, my people, my decision. If you're staying to protect them, then I'm staying to protect you." The admission hung in the air between them, heavy with implications that neither of them was quite ready to acknowledge. Peterson looked back and forth between them, clearly recognizing the undercurrents of personal connection that were influencing what should have been purely operational decisions. "Ma'am," Peterson said carefully, "I need to know who's in charge of this operation. The control room needs clear authority for emergency procedures." Rebecca straightened, feeling the full weight of corporate authority settling around her like armor she had temporarily set aside. When she spoke, her voice carried the unmistakable tone of someone accustomed to making decisions that affected thousands of lives and millions of dollars. "I am," she said simply. "And my first executive decision is that Mr. Morrison coordinates all technical aspects of the shutdown while I handle communications with corporate headquarters and regulatory authorities." Jake stared at her with an expression of growing understanding, as if pieces of a puzzle were finally falling into place in his mind. "Who exactly are you?" he asked, his voice carrying a note of suspicion that hadn't been there before. Rebecca felt the moment of truth arriving with the force of a physical blow. The careful anonymity she had maintained during their weekend together was no longer sustainable in the face of a crisis that required her to exercise the full authority of her corporate position. "Rebecca Chun," she said, meeting his gaze directly. "Chief Executive Officer, Chun Petroleum Industries." The silence that followed her admission was broken only by the mechanical noise of the platform's emergency systems and the distant sound of helicopters arriving to coordinate the evacuation. Jake's expression went through a series of changes, from surprise to understanding to something that might have been betrayal. "Chun Petroleum," he repeated slowly, his voice flat with the kind of careful control that suggested he was processing information that fundamentally changed his understanding of their relationship. "You own this platform. You own the company I work for." Rebecca nodded, feeling the warmth and trust that had developed between them over the weekend evaporating like steam in the mechanical heat of the engine room. "I do," she admitted, "and I should have told you from the beginning, but I wanted to understand what it was really like to work for my company before I revealed who I was." Jake turned away from her, his attention apparently focused on the monitoring equipment, but his body language suggesting he was struggling with emotions that went far beyond professional surprise. When he finally spoke again, his voice carried a bitter edge that Rebecca had never heard from him before. "So the weekend was what exactly?" he asked without looking at her. "Corporate research? Executive team building? A little slumming with the working class to make yourself feel more authentic?" The accusation hit Rebecca like a physical blow, all the more painful because she could understand how her deception might appear from his perspective. The genuine connection she had felt with Jake and his community now seemed tainted by the dishonesty that had made it possible. "It wasn't like that," she said, her voice carrying a desperation that she rarely allowed into her professional communications. "I came here to assess the platform damage, yes, but everything else was real. My interest in your community, my respect for your work, my feelings about spending time with you and Tommy, all of that was completely genuine." Jake finally turned back to face her, and Rebecca saw in his expression the kind of hurt that went beyond professional disappointment to something deeply personal. "How can I know what's genuine when you've been lying about who you are from the moment we met?" Before Rebecca could respond, Peterson's radio crackled with an urgent update from the control room. "Containment stress indicators approaching critical levels," came the voice. "Estimate 15 minutes before manual intervention required." The immediate crisis forced both Rebecca and Jake to set aside their personal conflict in favor of the technical challenges that would determine whether the evacuation succeeded without environmental catastrophe. They worked together with professional efficiency, their personal connection temporarily subsumed beneath the demands of expertise and leadership that the emergency required. But Rebecca could feel the change in Jake's manner, the way he now addressed her with the formal courtesy reserved for corporate superiors, rather than the easy familiarity that had characterized their previous interactions. The warmth and trust that had developed between them over the weekend had been replaced by the careful distance that employees maintained with powerful executives, whose decisions could affect their livelihoods. As the evacuation proceeded and the platform systems gradually stabilized under emergency shutdown protocols, Rebecca found herself working alongside a man who treated her with professional respect but personal coolness. Jake's technical expertise remained as impressive as ever, but the openness and genuine connection that had drawn her to him seemed to have vanished along with his trust and her honesty. When the immediate crisis had passed and the platform was secured in emergency shutdown mode, Rebecca and Jake found themselves alone in the engine room for the first time since her revelation. The mechanical noise had decreased significantly with the shutdown of the drilling systems, making normal conversation possible again. "We need to talk," Rebecca said, her voice carrying the weight of everything that had changed between them. In the space of a few hours. Jake nodded but didn't look at her, his attention focused on securing the improvised repair equipment that had helped them through the crisis. "I suppose we do," he said quietly, "though I'm not sure what there is to say." Rebecca struggled to find words that would bridge the gap that her deception had created between them. In her corporate world, such revelations were managed through carefully crafted communication strategies and legal frameworks that protected all parties. But here, facing a man whose trust she had earned through shared experience and then lost through dishonesty, she found herself without the professional tools that usually guided her through difficult conversations. "I never intended to deceive you," she said finally, knowing how inadequate the words sounded even as she spoke them. "When we first met, you didn't know who I was, and it felt liberating to interact with someone who saw me as a person rather than a position. By the time I should have told you, I was afraid of losing that connection. Jake finally looked at her, and Rebecca saw in his expression a mixture of understanding and disappointment that was more painful than simple anger would have been. You think I can't separate the person from the position? He asked. You think learning that you're the CEO would have changed how I treated you? The question forced Rebecca to confront assumptions she had made about Jake's likely reaction to her corporate identity. She realized that her decision to maintain anonymity had been based more on her own insecurities about being valued for herself rather than her position than on any evidence that Jake would have treated her differently. I don't know, she admitted. In my experience, people either want something from me or they're intimidated by what I represent. You were the first person in years who seemed interested in who I am rather than what I could do for them. Jake was quiet for a long moment, apparently considering her explanation with the same careful thought he brought to mechanical problems. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a sadness that suggested the loss of something valuable rather than simple professional disappointment. The person I spent the weekend with was someone I was beginning to care about, he said quietly. Someone who seemed to understand the value of community and family, who appreciated simple things like neighborhood soccer games and home-cooked meals. Someone who made me think that maybe there were people in positions of power who hadn't forgotten what it meant to be human. Rebecca felt tears threatening for the first time in years, overwhelmed by the realization that her deception had cost her not just Jake's trust but potentially the most meaningful personal connection she had experienced in her adult life. That person is still here, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The title and the money don't change who I am inside. Jake shook his head, his expression reflecting the kind of deep disappointment that comes from having one's fundamental assumptions about someone proven wrong. But they change everything else, he said. They change the power dynamic between us. They change the implications of any personal relationship we might have. They change what it means for me to trust you with my son's safety and my community's welfare. The brutal honesty of his assessment forced Rebecca to confront the reality that her corporate success had created barriers to genuine, human connection that went far beyond simple social awkwardness. The power and wealth that had given her the ability to shape entire industries had also isolated her from the kinds of relationships that gave life its deeper meaning. So what happens now? She asked, dreading the answer but needing to understand where they stood in the aftermath of her revelation. Jake turned back to his monitoring equipment, his body language suggesting that the conversation was approaching its end. Now we finish securing the platform, he said without looking at her. You go back to your corporate responsibilities, and I go back to mine. We pretend the weekend never happened and try to maintain a professional relationship that doesn't compromise either of our positions. The casual dismissal of everything they had shared hit Rebecca harder than any corporate setback she had ever experienced. In the space of a few hours, she had lost not only Jake's trust and respect, but also her connection to the community that had reminded her of values and priorities she had abandoned during her climb to executive success. As they completed the final security procedures and prepared to leave the platform, Rebecca found herself mourning the loss of something she had only just begun to understand she wanted. The corporate world she would return to seemed suddenly empty and purposeless compared to the authentic human connections she had experienced in Jake's neighborhood. But perhaps the most painful realization was that her own choices and deceptions had destroyed the possibility of building something meaningful with a man who represented everything she had given up in pursuit of professional achievement. Jake's willingness to risk his life for his co-workers, his dedication to his son, his commitment to his community, all spoke to a kind of integrity that her corporate success had not prepared her to match. As the helicopter carried them back to the mainland, Rebecca stared out at the lights of platform Delta 7, growing smaller in the distance, and wondered if she had just experienced the most expensive lesson of her career. The platform could be repaired and returned to production, but the trust and connection she had lost might prove irreplaceable. Jake sat across from her in the helicopter's cabin, his attention focused on technical reports rather than conversation. The easy warmth that had characterized their interactions over the weekend had been replaced by the careful professionalism that employees used with executives whose displeasure could end careers. When they finally landed in New Orleans, Jake gathered his equipment and prepared to leave, without the personal farewell that might have ended their weekend together under different circumstances. But as he reached the helicopter's door, he paused and looked back at Rebecca with an expression that suggested their conversation was not quite finished. "For what it's worth," he said, his voice barely audible over the helicopter's engines, "the person you were this weekend, the one who cared about community and family and doing the right thing regardless of the cost, that person could have had anything she wanted from me. But I can't trust someone who lies about something that fundamental." With that, Jake stepped out of the helicopter and walked away into the Louisiana night, leaving Rebecca alone with the weight of choices that had cost her more than any business decision she had ever made. As she watched his figure disappear into the darkness, she realized that all her corporate success meant nothing if it came at the cost of her ability to form genuine, human connections with people who mattered. The ride back to her hotel was a blur of city lights and regret, punctuated by urgent phone calls from corporate headquarters demanding updates on the platform situation and projections for the financial impact of the emergency shutdown. Rebecca handled the calls with her usual professional competence, but her heart wasn't in the strategic discussions and damage control planning that would normally have commanded her full attention. As she finally reached her hotel room and prepared for a few hours of sleep before the inevitable corporate crisis meetings that would dominate the following day, Rebecca found herself thinking not about quarterly projections or stockholder reactions, but about a small boy who would wake up wondering whether his father had returned safely from his dangerous work. She wondered if Jake would tell Tommy about the revelation of her true identity, and what the boy would think of the woman who had seemed so interested in their community but had turned out to be just another corporate executive playing roles for reasons he couldn't understand. The thought of losing Tommy's innocent trust was almost as painful as losing Jake's respect. But perhaps most troubling was the realization that her deception had not only cost her a personal relationship, but had also undermined her ability to create the kind of positive change in her industry that had originally motivated her climb to corporate power. Jake's integrity and commitment to safety over profit had shown her what principled leadership looked like, but her dishonesty had destroyed any possibility of learning from his example or building the kind of partnership that might have bridged the gap between corporate power and operational wisdom. As Rebecca finally fell asleep in her anonymous hotel room, she carried with her the weight of understanding that she had found something precious in Jake Morrison's world and then lost it through choices that revealed the moral compromises her success had required. The question that would haunt her in the days to come was whether it was possible to reclaim her authentic self without sacrificing everything she had built, and whether a man like Jake Morrison could ever trust someone who had proven capable of such fundamental deception. The platform crisis had been resolved through competent technical expertise and sound safety decisions, but the personal crisis it had revealed would prove far more difficult to repair. Rebecca had learned the difference between professional success and personal integrity, but the lesson had come at a cost that no amount of corporate achievement could justify. In his modest home across the city, Jake Morrison was facing his own crisis of understanding as he processed the events of the day and their implications for his future. The woman he had begun to care for had turned out to be the executive whose decisions controlled his livelihood and the welfare of his coworkers. The trust and connection he had felt developing between them now seemed like naive illusion, based on a false premise that had made genuine relationship impossible from the beginning. As Jake checked on his sleeping son and prepared for his own restless night, He carried with him the bitter knowledge that even in a world where most things could be fixed with the right tools and sufficient expertise, some kinds of damage might prove irreparable. The question that would challenge him in the coming days was whether the person Rebecca had revealed herself to be over the weekend was real enough to justify the risk of trusting someone whose power over his life was absolute and whose willingness to deceive had been so complete. The boardroom fell silent as Rebecca finished her presentation to the Chun Petroleum Industries Executive Committee, her voice steady despite the gravity of what she was proposing. Seated around the mahogany table were 12 of the most powerful figures in the petroleum industry, men and women whose decisions shaped global energy markets and whose approval she needed for the most important initiative of her career. "Let me understand this correctly," said Marcus Webb, the chairman of the board, his voice carrying the skeptical tone that had characterized the entire meeting. "You want to implement company-wide safety protocols that will cost us approximately $200 million annually, reduce production efficiency by 15%, and establish worker safety committees with real authority to shut down operations when they deem conditions unsafe." Rebecca nodded calmly, though her heart was racing with the implications of what she was asking. "That's correct. Additionally, I'm proposing we establish a community investment fund that dedicates 5% of annual profits to supporting the families and neighborhoods where our workers live." The murmur of disapproval that ran around the table was exactly what Rebecca had expected. In the 3 weeks since the Platform Delta 7 crisis, she had spent countless hours developing this proposal, knowing it would face fierce resistance from executives whose primary concern was maximizing shareholder returns. "Rebecca," said Helen Morrison, the company's chief financial officer, "these proposals would fundamentally alter our competitive position in the market. Our shareholders expect returns, not social programs." Rebecca had anticipated this objection, but hearing it articulated so bluntly reminded her of how far removed her corporate colleagues were from the human reality of the industry they controlled. "Our shareholders expect sustainable long-term growth," she replied. "And that's impossible if we continue treating our workers as expendable resources rather than the skilled professionals who actually generate our profits." Marcus leaned back in his chair, studying Rebecca with the calculating expression that had made him one of the most feared negotiators in the industry. "What's really driving this proposal, Rebecca? Because it represents a fundamental departure from the business model that's made Chun Petroleum one of the most profitable companies in the sector." The question forced Rebecca to confront the personal motivations that had shaped her professional recommendations. She thought about Jake Morrison, working alone in a dangerous engine room to protect his co-workers, and about Tommy, who deserved to have his father come home safely from every shift. She thought about the community center where Jake volunteered, his expertise to help neighbors solve their problems, and about the neighborhood soccer games where families supported each other through the challenges of blue-collar life. "What's driving this proposal," Rebecca said carefully, "is the recognition that our current business model is unsustainable both morally and economically. We're asking people to risk their lives for our profits while providing them with minimal job security, inadequate safety protocols, and no real voice in the conditions of their employment. That's not just wrong, it's bad business." "Bad business?" Marcus's eyebrows rose in genuine surprise. "Chun Petroleum's profits have increased by 40% under your leadership. Our stock price has tripled. By any objective measure, our business model is extraordinarily successful." Rebecca felt the weight of the moment settling around her, understanding that her next words would likely determine not only the fate of her proposal but potentially her future with the company. She had built. "Success measured purely in financial terms is ultimately hollow if it comes at the cost of human dignity and community welfare," she said quietly. "I've learned that there are kinds of wealth that can't be quantified in quarterly reports." The silence that followed her statement was heavy with implications that everyone in the room understood. Rebecca was essentially challenging the fundamental assumptions that guided corporate decision-making in their industry, proposing a model that prioritized worker welfare and community investment over maximum profit extraction. "Rebecca," Helen said gently, "I think we all admire your humanitarian instincts. But Chun Petroleum is a publicly traded corporation with fiduciary responsibilities to our shareholders. We can't justify spending hundreds of millions of dollars on social programs that don't directly contribute to profitability." Rebecca had prepared for this moment, knowing that her proposal would ultimately force a confrontation between competing visions of corporate responsibility. "Then I'm prepared to offer an alternative," she said, reaching for the second folder she had brought to the meeting. Marcus gestured for her to continue, his expression suggesting curiosity about what other surprises she might have in store. "I'm offering to buy out the company's public shareholders and take Chun Petroleum private," Rebecca announced, her voice carrying the calm authority that had characterized her most important business decisions. "I'll purchase all outstanding shares at a 20% premium over current market value, which will give shareholders an immediate profit while freeing the company from the quarterly pressure that prevents long-term strategic thinking." The reaction around the table was immediate and intense. Several board members began talking at once, their voices mixing in a cacophony of surprise, concern, and calculation. Marcus raised his hand for silence, his expression grave as he processed the implications of Rebecca's proposal. "That would cost you approximately $8 billion, he said slowly. "Even with your personal wealth and the company's assets, that's an enormous financial commitment that would leverage everything you've built." Rebecca nodded, feeling the weight of the decision she had made during the sleepless nights following her return from Louisiana. "It would," she agreed. "But it would also give me the freedom to run this company according to principles that I believe will ultimately prove more profitable than our current model." "And if you're wrong?" Helen asked, her voice carrying genuine concern for Rebecca's financial welfare. "If the new model doesn't generate sufficient returns to service the debt you'll incur in the buyout." Rebecca met Helen's gaze steadily, thinking about Jake's willingness to risk his career by shutting down a profitable operation to protect worker safety. "Then I'll have failed attempting something worthwhile, rather than succeeded at something morally bankrupt." The meeting continued for another 2 hours, with Rebecca fielding detailed questions about financing, implementation timelines, and regulatory approvals. But she could see in the board members' faces that the decision had essentially been made. They would accept her buyout offer because it provided them with immediate profit and removed them from responsibility for whatever came next. As the meeting finally concluded and the other executives filed out of the boardroom, Marcus remained behind, his expression thoughtful as he studied Rebecca with new interest. "This is about more than business philosophy, isn't it?" he asked, when they were alone. "Something happened in Louisiana that changed your perspective on what success looks like." Rebecca considered how much to reveal about the personal experiences that had shaped her professional transformation. "I met someone who reminded me of who I used to be before I became so focused on winning that I forgot what I was supposed to be winning for." Marcus nodded slowly, his expression suggesting understanding rather than judgment. "And now you're willing to risk everything to prove that you can be that person again?" "I'm willing to risk everything to become the kind of leader who deserves the loyalty of people like the workers on Platform Delta 7, Rebecca replied. "People who put their lives on the line every day to make our profits possible." 3 days later, Rebecca found herself standing outside Jake Morrison's modest home in New Orleans, her hands trembling slightly as she prepared to knock on the door. The buyout negotiations were proceeding smoothly, but she had realized that her professional transformation would be meaningless unless she could also repair the personal damage her deception had caused. The door opened before she could knock, revealing Tommy Morrison with his characteristic direct gaze and serious expression. The boy studied her for a moment, apparently assessing whether her presence was welcome or threatening. "Hi, Tommy," Rebecca said gently. "Is your dad home?" Tommy nodded but didn't immediately invite her in, his 8-year-old instincts apparently picking up on the tension that surrounded her relationship with his father. "He's in the garage, fixing Mrs. Rodriguez's car. He said you might come by sometime." The information that Jake had mentioned her to his son sent a flutter of hope through Rebecca's chest, suggesting that perhaps their connection hadn't been completely severed by her revelation. "Did he say anything else about me?" she asked, immediately regretting the question as inappropriate to ask of a child. Tommy considered the question with the seriousness that seemed to characterize his approach to adult conversations. "He said you're someone who made a mistake, but that you're trying to fix it. He says everybody deserves a chance to make things right if they're really sorry." The simple wisdom of Jake's words, filtered through his son's innocent perspective, struck Rebecca with unexpected force. She had spent weeks agonizing over whether Jake could ever forgive her deception, but perhaps she had underestimated his capacity for understanding human complexity and moral growth. "Is it okay if I go talk to him?" Rebecca asked, recognizing that Tommy's approval was essential to any possibility of reconciliation with his father. Tommy stepped aside to let her enter, then led her through the house toward the garage, where the sound of mechanical work could be heard. "Just so you know," he said seriously, "Dad's been kind of sad since he came back from the oil rig. Not angry sad, just quiet sad, like when Mom first left." The comparison to Jake's reaction to his divorce sent a pang of guilt through Rebecca's chest, reminding her that her deception had touched emotional wounds that went far beyond simple professional disappointment. She had damaged Jake's ability to trust in ways that connected to his deepest fears about abandonment and betrayal. The garage was much like Jake himself, organized and purposeful, with tools arranged according to function and projects in various stages of completion. Jake was bent over the engine of an aging sedan, his attention focused on some mechanical problem that required delicate adjustment. "Dad," Tommy announced, "Rebecca's here to see you." Jake straightened slowly, his expression carefully neutral, as he turned to face her. He was wearing the same kind of work clothes she had first seen him in, but now she understood that they represented not just practicality, but a conscious choice to remain connected to work that had meaning beyond financial compensation. "Rebecca," he said quietly, wiping his hands on a rag with the methodical precision that characterized all his movements. "I heard about the company buyout. That's a significant decision." Rebecca felt her heart sink at the formal tone of his greeting, so different from the easy warmth that had characterized their earlier interactions. "It seemed like the right thing to do," she replied. "The only way to implement the changes that need to happen." Jake nodded, his expression suggesting he understood the business implications, even if he remained skeptical about her personal motivations. "Tommy, why don't you go check on your homework while Miss Chun and I talk?" Tommy looked back and forth between the adults, apparently sensing the undercurrents of emotion that neither was directly expressing. "Are you guys going to be okay?" he asked with the directness that seemed to be a family trait. "We're going to talk honestly about some difficult things," Jake replied, ruffling his son's hair with obvious affection. "That's usually the first step toward being okay." After Tommy left, Rebecca and Jake stood in awkward silence for a moment, both apparently struggling with how to begin a conversation that carried so much emotional weight. Finally, Rebecca spoke, her voice carrying none of her usual corporate confidence. "I know you have no reason to trust anything I say," she began, "but I need you to know that everything I felt during our weekend together was real. My interest in your community, my respect for your work, my feelings about spending time with you and Tommy, none of that was part of some corporate strategy." Jake leaned against his workbench, his expression thoughtful rather than angry. "I've had 3 weeks to think about what happened," he said quietly, "and I've realized that maybe I was being unfair to expect perfect honesty from someone I'd just met, especially given the power dynamics involved." Rebecca felt a flicker of hope at his words, but also confusion about what had changed his perspective. "What do you mean?" "I mean that you were probably right to be cautious about revealing your identity," Jake replied. "In your position, complete honesty with a stranger could be dangerous in ways I don't fully understand. Maybe the fact that you eventually told me the truth, even when it cost you something important, says more about your character than the initial deception." The generous interpretation of her actions was more than Rebecca had dared to hope for, but she sensed that Jake's forgiveness came with conditions that he hadn't yet articulated. "I want to make things right," she said. "Not just professionally, but personally. What we had felt important in ways I haven't experienced in years." Jake studied her face for a long moment, apparently searching for evidence of sincerity behind her words. "What we had was based on a version of you that may not be sustainable in your real life," he said finally. "The woman who enjoyed neighborhood soccer games and community center volunteering might not survive the pressures of running a multi-billion-dollar corporation." Rebecca felt the challenge in his words, understanding that he was essentially asking her to prove that her weekend transformation represented genuine change rather than temporary sentiment. "Then help me figure out how to make it sustainable," she said. "Show me how to be the kind of leader who deserves the loyalty of people like you." "I can't show you how to be someone you're not," Jake replied. "But I can show you what it looks like when someone chooses to put principles above profit, even when it costs them everything they've worked for." Rebecca realized that Jake was offering her something more valuable than forgiveness. He was offering to be the kind of mentor who could help her navigate the moral challenges of principled leadership. "What would that look like?" she asked. Jake gestured toward the car he had been working on, his expression carrying the first hint of warmth she had seen since arriving. "It starts with understanding that every decision affects real people with real lives. Mrs. Rodriguez needs this car to get to her job at the hospital, but she can't afford to pay a mechanic full price for the repairs. So I fix it for cost and help her learn basic maintenance so she won't need expensive repairs as often." Rebecca nodded, beginning to understand that Jake was describing a model of service that prioritized relationship and community welfare over maximum profit extraction. "And how does that translate to corporate decision-making?" "Same principle, bigger scale," Jake replied. "Every safety protocol you implement or affects families like mine. Every decision to prioritize short-term profits over long-term. Sustainability impacts communities that depend on your industry for their livelihoods. The numbers on your quarterly reports represent people's ability to feed their children and send them to college." The conversation was interrupted by Tommy's return to the garage, apparently having completed his homework and decided that the adult discussion had gone on long enough without his supervision. "Are you staying for dinner?" he asked Rebecca, with the directness that she was learning to expect from the Morrison family. Rebecca looked at Jake questioningly, unsure whether the invitation represented his son's wishful thinking or a genuine offer of reconciliation. Jake's expression softened as he looked at Tommy, and she could see the internal struggle between his protective instincts and his desire to model forgiveness and second chances for his son. "That depends on whether your dad thinks it's a good idea," Rebecca replied, putting the decision squarely in Jake's hands. Jake was quiet for a moment, apparently weighing considerations that went beyond simple personal preference. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the careful tone of someone making a decision that would have lasting consequences. "Dinner would be fine," he said quietly. "But I need you to understand that if you're going to be part of Tommy's life, even occasionally, I need to know that you're committed to being the person you were last weekend, not just when it's convenient or emotionally satisfying." Rebecca felt the weight of what Jake was asking, understanding that he was essentially requesting a guarantee that she could transform her corporate identity in ways that would make her trustworthy around his son. "I can't promise I won't make mistakes," she said honestly. But I can promise that I'll keep trying to be worthy of the trust you're both willing to give me." Tommy beamed at the adult resolution of whatever conflict had been troubling his father, apparently satisfied that the important people in his life were going to find a way to get along. "Can we make spaghetti?" he asked Jake. "I want to show Rebecca how I can make the sauce by myself." As they moved into the house and began preparing dinner together, Rebecca found herself slipping back into the easy rhythm of family life that had felt so natural during their weekend together. But now she was acutely aware of how fragile these moments were, how easily they could be disrupted by the demands and pressures of her corporate responsibilities. "I've been thinking about what you said," Jake mentioned as they worked side by side in the kitchen, Tommy chattering enthusiastically about his day at school, about needing someone to show you how to balance principles with business pressures. Rebecca paused in her chopping of vegetables, sensing that Jake was approaching something important. "And I've been offered a position with the new safety oversight committee that your company is implementing," he said carefully. "It would mean moving into management, working directly with corporate leadership to develop safety protocols that actually protect workers rather than just satisfying regulatory requirements." Rebecca felt her pulse quicken at the implications of Jake's announcement. "Are you considering it?" Jake nodded slowly, his attention focused on the pasta he was preparing. It would mean better hours, more time with Tommy, and the chance to make real improvements in worker safety. But it would also mean working closely with you on a regular basis, and I'm not sure either of us is ready for that kind of professional relationship. Rebecca understood the complexity of what Jake was describing. A professional relationship between them would be complicated by their personal history and the power dynamics that made genuine equality impossible. But it also represented an opportunity to build the kind of partnership that could create meaningful change in their industry. "What would make you ready?" she asked, recognizing that the question applied to both professional collaboration and personal reconciliation. Jake turned to face her directly, his expression serious but not unkind. "Time," he said simply. "Time to see whether the changes you're making are sustainable, whether the person you were last weekend can coexist with the executive who runs Petroleum Industries." "And if they can?" Rebecca asked, hardly daring to hope for the answer she wanted. Jake's smile was slow but genuine, transforming his serious features in a way that sent warmth flooding through Rebecca's chest. "Then maybe we can figure out what it looks like to build something together that's worthy of both our efforts." As they sat down to dinner in Jake's modest kitchen, Rebecca found herself thinking not about corporate strategy or financial projections, but about the possibility of building a life that integrated professional purpose with personal meaning. Tommy's animated conversation about his science project, Jake's quiet satisfaction with the simple meal they had prepared together, the easy intimacy of shared domestic tasks, all represented a kind of wealth that no amount of corporate success could replicate. After dinner, as Rebecca prepared to return to her hotel, Tommy approached her with the serious expression that preceded his most important communications. "Are you going to keep coming around?" he asked directly. Rebecca knelt to meet him at eye level, understanding that her answer would shape not only her relationship with Tommy, but also the foundation for whatever might develop with his father. "I'd like to," she said honestly. "If your dad thinks it's okay, and if you want me to." Tommy nodded gravely, apparently satisfied with her response. "Good," he said simply. "Dad's been happier when you're around, even when he's trying to act like he's not." The child's observation about his father's emotional state sent a flutter of hope through Rebecca's chest, suggesting that perhaps Jake's feelings about their relationship were more positive than his careful words had indicated. As she said goodbye and walked toward her car, she felt Jake's hand on her shoulder. "Rebecca," he said quietly, "what you're trying to do with the company, it matters. Not just because it's the right thing, but because it shows you understand That real success isn't measured in stock prices or quarterly profits. Rebecca turned to face him, noting the warmth in his expression that had been missing during their earlier conversation. "I'm learning that from someone who never forgot what success really looks like," she replied. Jake's smile was genuine this time, lacking the careful restraint that had characterized his earlier responses to her presence. "The job offer with the safety committee," he said. "I'm going to accept it. Not because I think working together will be easy, but because I think it might be important." As Rebecca drove back to her hotel, she carried with her the understanding that she and Jake were embarking on something unprecedented in her experience, a relationship based on mutual respect, shared values, and the commitment to create something better than what either could achieve alone. The road ahead would be challenging, requiring them to navigate the complexities of personal attraction, professional collaboration, and the power dynamics that made genuine equality difficult. But, for the first time in years, Rebecca felt that she was moving toward something more meaningful than simple corporate success. She was building a life that integrated her professional capabilities with her personal values, guided by the wisdom of a man who had never forgotten that the purpose of work was to serve something larger than individual ambition. The buyout of Chun Petroleum Industries would be completed within weeks, giving Rebecca the freedom to implement the changes that would transform her company from a profit-maximizing machine into an organization that balanced financial success with worker welfare and community investment. But perhaps more importantly, she had found a partner who could help her navigate the moral challenges of principled leadership, while building the kind of personal relationship that gave professional success its deeper meaning. As she fell asleep that night, Rebecca carried with her the image of Tommy's proud smile as he demonstrated his cooking skills, and Jake's quiet satisfaction as he watched his son flourish in the presence of someone who valued both his intelligence and his innocence. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities, but tonight she rested in the knowledge that she had found her way back to the person she had always meant to become. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.